The Russians are often playing the role of the adult in the room in these scenarios. Like they will only respond to an escalation if they really need to. They do not want to see the situation in the Baltic region escalate further than it has been escalating. And you also have to consider something else. When I mentioned about how the Russians felt betrayed by, the continental West Europeans, the sense of betrayal is much stronger when it comes to Finland and Sweden, the Scandinavian countries in particular.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Pietro Shakarian, an Armenian historian at the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, who has analyzed the Russian-Iranian relationship for a while. We're talking today on June 19th, only 6 days after Israel's sneak attack on Iran, and currently everybody is waiting for what the US will do. But a direct military attack still seems likely, at least at this point, and what this means for the relationship between Russia and Iran is what we want to discuss today. So, Pietro, welcome back.
Pascal, it's great to be on your show again. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming online. And coincidentally, I had a talk with another colleague on military affairs just earlier on the military relationship between Russia and Iran. But with you, I would like to look at the political level, which you analyzed, also like the treaty that was recently created. Could you give us a rundown of how you think that the situation in and around Iran is now affecting Russia's political choices?
Well, first and foremost, we have to consider the dynamic of the January Pact, which I'm not going to go through each point again on your program because I already did that. But just to reiterate to your audience, the treaty envisions a deepening of technical military cooperation, but it is not a mutual defense pact. That's very important to understand. Moreover, and this is an important point too, and this is what Russian analysts will emphasize to you, that both the Russian side and the Iranian side are not at the point where they want to bring it to a mutual defense pact level. That's extremely important. So there was not this situation where, let's say, Iran wanted to make a defense pact and Russia, betrayed Iran or something like this. And by the way, these narratives about Russia being an untrustworthy ally of Iran, this kind of narrative is designed in the Western media to drive a wedge between Russia and Iran. So if you are subscribing to this idea that, I'm saying in general to your audience, if there is anybody out there who's subscribing to this idea that Russia will betray Iran or that Russia has betrayed Iran, you're adopting a narrative that is meant to drive a wedge between these two countries, right? So it serves a geopolitical purpose. But in any case, the point is that they're just content right now with where their relations are at, with intelligence cooperation maybe in kind of military assistance, technical assistance, but not necessarily a outright kind of mutual defense pact. It's extremely important to emphasize that point alone. So yeah, no, and also you have to understand the stakes for Russia and actually also for China in this regard, because again, I put into context the Eurasian backdrop. If, for example, so again, the whole initial attack by Israel against Iran was motivated by this idea, at least this is what they were saying about the nuclear program, to take out Iran's nuclear program. But in truth, we can see that quickly the objective of the attack changed. And Benjamin Netanyahu declared that it was about regime change, right? Even the name of the operation, Operation Rising Lion, right? The lion, the national symbol of Persia, of Iran. So the idea was to maybe instigate kind of an uprising. But God forbid, if there was a regime change in Iran, again, think about this. This is a country of 90 million people. By area, it's the size of Mongolia. It's not Syria. It's not Iraq. If a country like that were to be, dismantled or destabilized, God help us for the whole region, because look at all the countries they border. The former Soviet republics in the Caucasus and Central Asia, this has a direct bearing on Russian security. Also, if there was a destabilized Iranian state, it would obstruct Russia's access further south, to the Persian Gulf, right? Also, this would also affect China, undoubtedly. So anyway, but those are some points to kind of consider. Russia has an interest in seeing Iran not fail. But it also feels at this point, and the Iranians too feel at this point, that they're strong enough. The Iranians feel strong enough that they don't necessarily need a mutual defense pact.
Right. And the same point, Stanislav Krapivnik, whom I just talked to, he also emphasized that the soft underbelly of Russia is a strategic vulnerability, of course, from the Russian point of view. So, and Iran is very pivotal in actually making sure that no such threats of groups well, we call them terrorists or just like politically motivated, and also then, of course, by U.S. proxy and CIA forces, then can infiltrate this line. But do you think the Russians are now looking at an increased military to military cooperation among them, or what kind of support do you think is Russia trying to give Iran, other than the diplomatic efforts that Vladimir Putin was offering, with okay, let's mediate this that has been floating around the last couple of days, and which it seems that neither the Israelis nor the Americans are really willing to take?
Well, first of all, we have to look at the fact that the diplomatic overtures, the diplomatic statements, the diplomatic moves, that's not nothing. Okay, so everybody thinks that, well, it's just rhetoric, it's just, that we support Iran or whatever, and it's not really anything, but it really is quite important. And also you have to consider, Pascal, that the Iranians often ask for this diplomatic assistance from the Russian side. Yeah. It's not like as if Russia is just making these statements. Iran is asking, Russia is basically saying for Iran, what can we do for you? And Iran is saying, if you could support us, let's say in the UN, right? Russia and China were the only two permanent members of the Security Council that supported Iran in the UN when this attack, and when it got underway. And also you have to consider the fact that for even something like some of those statements by the Russian ambassador to the UN, for example, were extraordinarily strong. Like that Israel violated international law, that it tore up the UN Charter. This kind of rhetoric is actually quite, significant. So the political and diplomatic support, that is actually quite important but for both sides. But there is also this element when we talk about military technical cooperation. It's not something, even if I knew let's say, even if I knew all the details, I couldn't openly discuss it on this podcast. This is stuff that would be largely going on behind the scenes between Russia and Iran. There are details of which we are not privy about, but I can assure you that the military technical ties between Russia and Iran are very intensive. And at some point also, it's also limited because both sides, are not yet ready to take it to the next step. Even this pact of January, we have to also understand that this was the result of, basically it was a reflection of where the relations had evolved to. It was codifying on paper the fact that the previous agreements between Russia and Iran were outdated, and now it needed to be succeeded by something else that really reflected the nature of that relationship. So, but also you have to consider too that both sides are not ready yet for a mutual defense pact, and also we should also think about this. Why must we assume, in let's say the alternative media sphere, that somehow Iran needs to be saved by Russia or China? That's like only in the worst case scenario. Right now, Iran is doing pretty good on its own. So sure, in the beginning, it was a little tough for Iran, but look there, if you talk to Ted Postal of MIT, look at what Iran is doing with Israel's Iron Dome. They've completely shattered it. And meanwhile, you see the Iranian air defenses, they're nothing to sneeze at. Initially, when Israel sabotaged the Iranian air defenses at the beginning, it was very difficult for Iran. But now Iran is back online, and you can see over Tehran, sure, there's strikes, but Iran has been quite successful at intercepting um, a lot of these Israeli missiles coming in. So think of it like this, that Iran, like I said, a country of 90 million people, major human resources, and a very large country. Now, there are also problems there too, because of such a large country, you have situations where, like, Israel can infiltrate, Mossad can infiltrate with its spies into Iran. Not too dissimilar from what we've seen between Russia and Ukraine, right? Again, even the drone attack, that was all, down to a T. That was exactly like what happened with Russia with the Ukrainians, where they went into the interior of Russia and they set up these drones to kind of launch on their own and so on and so forth. But even the issue of the spies, even the issue of espionage, because, for instance, if you live in Russia, as I do, you see news reports periodically about how the FSB is, they're, you know, cracking some Ukrainian spy ring, or they've, sabotaged a Ukrainian terrorist attack. So they have a problem here too, in Russia, with spies who try to, even with the FSB, which is one of the top intelligence services in the world. Still, you still have this problem. So Iran, it's a large country. Of course, you're going to have issues like that, but also it has enormous assets, and it should not be underestimated in this conflict with Israel at all, really.
No, you're absolutely right. And but the fact that the conflict, the war, Iran, I mean Israel against Iran, and behind the scenes US against Iran, and maybe overtly, I mean, so far the strike hasn't happened yet. I mean, the US so far hasn't thrown bombs directly on its own military assets on Iran. But if that happens, then that this will impact, of course, also the relationship with Russia and China, I think is evident. But in what way can we expect either more military to military cooperation, or in what way can we expect maybe the Russians politically talking to the Chinese, trying to figure out a triangle or a BRICS approach toward dealing this? Because it's not just an attack on Iran. It is a clear escalation of world affairs, and one that might spiral into much larger conflict, actually, doesn't
Yeah.
it?
Also consider this with what I was saying about that not only is the soft underbelly of Russia, which is to say, the former Soviet republics of the Caucasus and Central Asia, not only is that quite vulnerable to destabilized Iran, but also, again, like I said, it kind of cuts off, or does cut off. If Iran were destabilized, or if a pro-Western government were to come to power in Iran, it would cut off Russia's access to the Persian Gulf, to the Indian Ocean. It would be a really, really difficult situation for the Russians, and also for BRICS cooperation. Consider also, too, again, when we talk about China, the One Belt, One Road initiative, it would really cut off China from West Asia. If Iran was to be destabilized, or if even a pro-Western government were to come to power, like, if it's highly unlikely, but if the Shah's son, let's say, were to come to power in Iran, something like this, then at the end of the day, it would cut off China from West Asia. So for both Russia and China, they understand the stakes. They're fully cognizant of the stakes, and they have been consulting. There is going to be a phone call between Vladimir Putin and Xi this week, I believe, and that indicates the level of seriousness. And they're going to concretely talk about the situation in the Middle East and Iran. And even though, again, like, Putin is making a good faith peace proposal, saying, look, I have a proposal. Like, he has said at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum just recently that, look, here's a peace plan that I'm kind of outlining, where Iran, can continue to do its peaceful nuclear program, and Israel, its security can be ensured, right? But it's not clear, and unlikely, unfortunately, that Israel and the United States would accept this, as you said. But still, they're showing again that they're making the good faith gesture to it. But regardless of this, Russia and China both understand the need to support Iran, because if Iran falls, it's going to be a major blow, not only to Russia's immediate security and also China's, security, but also it's going to be a major blow to BRICS, to the North-South corridor. So when we talk about the former Soviet South, the two former Soviet republics of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, which are extraordinarily important in Central Asia as an overland link to Iran. That whole north-south corridor is what I'm saying would be moot if Iran were completely destabilized. And moreover, it would create security dilemmas for Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, to say nothing of Azerbaijan or Armenia. But even with Azerbaijan, there's also a concern that they might take advantage again of the instability, if there was a case like this, to maybe try and claim parts of Iran, because northern Iran, like I said, it's all inhabited by Azerbaijanis. But that also brings us to another point, that a destabilized Iran, think about the ethnic issues at play here. The Baluchis, the Kurds, all these different nationalities that live within Iran, because Persians only comprise, I believe, about maybe 50% of the population. And the remainder of the population are various ethnic minorities. Now, they're all integrated into the Iranian state. They all identify as Iranians, but they're all different ethnic groups. And so what the US and Israel are trying, when they talk about regime change and potentially bringing the Iraq or Libyan scenario or Syrian scenario to Iran, imagine what would happen, Pascal. It would be enormous. It would be an enormous catastrophe for the whole region. And yeah, I mean, what else can you say more about that?
Yeah, of course. The sad matter of the fact, though, is that if you look at the military strategy of Israel in its immediate neighborhood, then I cannot judge but that chaos in the neighborhood is what the strategy is all about. What you want to make sure is that the region is at war with each other. So you yourself are the dominant power, especially with the backing of the United States. So I mean, fomenting chaos in Iran, I think, is something that actually Israel and the United States actually, on their levels of what they would like to achieve. It's at least somewhere there. Maybe after regime change and complete control, but second or third prize would be a very unstable situation with internal warfare, right, among these different parties. And that is exactly something that Russia and China would want to prevent for the reasons that you just outlined. So what I'm wondering is what do you think is the actual approach now that these two BRICS actors are going to take to prevent the chaos from erupting?
Well, right now, it's not yet at a point where the situation is so out of control that they, let's say, need to rescue Iran, because Iran, like I said, can sustain itself. But certainly there's going to be the level of diplomatic support, also military technical cooperation. They're going to help the government in Iran as far as the government in Iran can go. And it will go pretty far, because this is not a government that yet is in like complete chaos, or that it's like completely cracking or completely falling. In fact, the Israeli strikes had the opposite intended effect. So the idea was, let's say, to turn the population against the leadership, and to, have them rise up and, I guess have a regime change, or like you say, a destabilized state. Again, this is part of this whole archipelago of destabilized states that would benefit Israel and the United States. But at the end of the day, the people rallied around the government. Because also you have to consider something else, which is actually quite interesting. Yes, so when you talk about Iran, it is a very diverse and multi-ethnic country. And I mentioned again about Azerbaijanis. We also have Kurds. You have all these other different nationalities. You have also Arabs in Khuzestan, Baluchis. We can go on with that, Talish. But on top of it, and of course the dominant Persians. But overall, the sense of nationalism in Iran is very strong. And it cuts across those ethnic divisions. That there is an understanding in that country that we are the inheritors of a great civilization. We are the inheritors of, we are the inheritors of Cyrus the Great. Even under the Islamic regime, even in the form of the Islamic Republic of Iran, that sense of Iranian nationalism, you could even say Persian nationalism, is extraordinarily strong. And if they're attacked, these people will fight to the death. Just like we saw with the Iran-Iraq war. Saddam thought he could, basically take out the government in Iran. He thought he could take Khuzestan, the Khuzestan province, oil-rich province. He thought he could right the wrongs because he felt like the Shah was giving him all sorts of issues. And he thought once Iran was destabilized, now that there was this revolution and this kind of revolutionary chaos as he saw it, now was his opportunity to kind of strike. But in the end, that consolidated the people. And actually, it consolidated the revolution, you could argue. And people still resent the fact that, like Saddam was using chemical weapons and all this, and that so much of this was supported by, it was supported by the West. And it comes down to it. So they remember this. And Iranians are extraordinarily strong people. And that's what's underestimated here, that these people will fight to the death. It's their country. And they're an ancient civilization. And that's something else that's really underestimated, not only in Tel Aviv, but certainly in Washington. When we talk about these countries, China, Russia, Iran, they're old countries, way older than the United States. Way older than the United States. And yet, still, you have the definition of stupidity. They keep on falling back on the same, policies in Washington, and you see where that's leading. Although now it's interesting, but I want to touch more on the United States, but I'll go back to you.
Yeah, I would like to go there actually, and because you're in St. Petersburg and your Russian colleagues and so on, what is the perception of this now? Because for the last 3 years we've heard the West, the collective West, yelling at the top of its lungs, international law, the sanctity of borders, unprovoked invasion, unacceptable. Everybody needs to condemn it because the rules-based order. Now we have a textbook aggression by a US ally, a European ally against a nation that really posed no threat. And even the wording, that the way that it's being spun in the West is it's a preemptive attack. It's obviously not. It's like being even if they were 1 or 2 years away, even if that was true of a nuclear bomb, even if Iran was about to get a nuclear bomb in 1 or 2 years, that would still not count as an
Also, I need to interject something here, which is Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying since 1984 that Iran has been 2 to 3 years away from a nuclear weapon. So how long have we?
He did, of course. But even if we suppose that was true, it would still not count as a reason under international law to actually do a preemptive attack. That would still not count.
It wouldn't.
But the West is now yelling this at the top of their lungs. And Friedrich Merz said, "Oh, we need to thank the Israelis for doing the dirty work for us. I mean, this is a very courageous thing, and we need to thank them and support them." How's this perceived over there?
Well, not very well. I mean, it's perceived as a massive violation of international law. I mean, Russians are highly critical of what Israel is doing, and not only with regard to Iran, but also with regard to the Palestinians in Gaza, as we know, with the genocide in Gaza. I mean, we can't call it anything else. I mean, it is, and that's what's so incredible about this, Pascal, that what's going on in Gaza is still going on. In fact, you have Palestinians who, they're attempting to receive aid, and they're being attacked as they're attempting to receive aid.
Daily. 30, 40, 50 people shot daily.
And this is all happening as the growing war with Iran is occurring. And that's what's actually so extraordinary about this, that how can Netanyahu think that he can do all this at once? I mean, he clearly believes he has immunity from the United States government. And not only, I should emphasize, I mean, it's very easy to make this into a Democrat-Republican thing and to make it sound like it's like, well, it's only, the Republicans and Trump, But even people should remember, this began under Joe Biden. It began under a Democratic president, actually, with regard to Gaza and even the threats toward Iran, because Netanyahu was already planning this strike on Iran in late 2024, as a matter of fact. But the other problem that we have to consider is even if Israel, well, first of all, Iran it's in a better position in terms of escalation, because Israel, first of all, can only escalate so far. It only has so many, missiles. And on top of it, Iran, like I said, is much larger and it has huge stockpile. So Iran can keep this going. I mean, Israel thought they could finish this in 2 weeks. It's not going to be finished in 2 weeks. But Benjamin Netanyahu is hoping he can fall back on Washington to save the day. And the problem is with this is that he thinks that they can easily take out in a surgical strike Iran's nuclear program. But the problem is, so much of that program, as you know, is deep, deep,
Yeah.
deep underground. And you would need a bunker buster bomb to do it. You need probably two. And probably what you would need is maybe six B-2 stealth bombers to do the job. And I mean, Iran has multiple sites, so you probably would need maybe 30 bombers.
Yeah, but you know,
And America doesn't have 30 bombers. America has 18.
yeah,
And also, it's not guaranteed that even if you strike one or two bombs at one site, it's going to destroy the site. There's no guarantee. There's no guarantee, Pascal. So
yeah,
what Trump is doing is an incredibly, if he were to do that, it'd be an incredibly risky move that could drag in the end the U.S. into a new forever war into Iran.
yeah, yeah. But there is one more problem, which is like the US as a fallback for if the war doesn't work is one. But there's one more thing, and that's the Israeli nuclear weapons. And looking at what
Oh,
they
well,
did to
that's
Gaza, I wouldn't actually be surprised if they would seriously contemplate using those weapons and even using them on Tehran. Um, what's your assessment about that?
if that were to happen, that would be an extraordinary escalation of the situation. And that might, because Iran, um, as far as we know, mostly, I mean, Iran does not have a nuclear weapon.
No.
And the bottom line is that if Israel were to do that, it could draw in other countries. It could maybe draw in Pakistan, which does have a nuclear weapon, and it would create very, very serious tension and escalation in the region, and it would really open up a Pandora's box. And even though like Israel thinks that, well, we can have like managed instability, we can destabilize Libya and Syria and Iraq and Iran and all these countries, and they'll all be destabilized, and that would make us more secure because they'll be fighting among themselves. Yeah, but that only works to some extent. That at some point they're going to lose control of the situation. And if that happens where they decide to use a nuclear bomb, that would be the beginning of really the end. I mean, we would be talking about seriously a third world war. That's when you might have at that point, possibly. Although I can't speak to this concretely because again, so much is. I mean, so much would be kind of discussed behind closed doors, let's say. So I can't speak to what strategies there would be, but at that point there would be maybe something where Russia would be involved, China would be involved. It could be like India would be involved. Certainly the United States, the hapless Europeans would be involved, and that would I'm saying that would be an extraordinary escalation that would really, really be bad for international security, the international environment, because what happens when you use a nuclear bomb. I mean, it's not going to enhance. If people are worried about global climate change, if they're worried about the environment,
Yeah, no,
wars,
no,
wars will be.
obviously, no,
No, I mean, yeah, absolutely.
I totally agree. I mean, it would be absolutely horrific, but it's if we look at the level of horrific things that have already been committed by the Israelis, it's for me, it's something in the realm of the thinkable, unfortunately. But I would rather want to ask you one more thing, which is, are there any kind of, so mixed feelings about Israel in Russia? Because I do remember it was Naftali Bennett at the time, the prime minister of Israel, who actually tried to help to broker a ceasefire between a ceasefire and then the resolution to the war in Ukraine. And we know from him that he was seriously trying to aid, and that he was told to stop it by the Americans. So what are the feelings of Russia also towards Israel, beyond just the immediate kind of escalation with Iran?
Well, Russia has, I mean, there are multiple ties Russia has to Israel in terms of especially former Soviet citizens who have emigrated to Israel,
Mhm.
particularly since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And also, Putin himself has a kind of a good contact with Benjamin Netanyahu, a good communication with him, but they don't agree on anything. From what I understand from Russian sources, they absolutely don't agree on any points, but still they have a line of communication. And also, there are many, there also, you have Russian Jewish population, there are ties to Israel in this way. But the connection between Russia and Israel, despite these ties that we have, it's not like, let's say, the relationship between Israel and the United States.
Mm.
That's to be really, clarified and put up front, for our audience to understand. And so while they would appreciate, let's say, Mr. Bennett's, um, peace initiatives toward Ukraine, Russia still understands that no country is above international law. No country can be permitted, just to attack another country with no reason, right? They were very strong about that. Actually, as a matter of fact, yesterday at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, Zakharova made a very strong statement about, Israel's attempted regime change in Iran, trying to provoke regime change in Iran. So international, to the Russian point of view, international law is international law.
Mm.
So even if Russia has these ties with Israel, it has, there are former Soviet citizens in Israel. Um, there are Russian speakers in Israel. Regardless of that, that doesn't change the fact that Israel is massively violating international law, that is committing atrocities against the Palestinian people. And you even have cases, by the way, where you have some people who, let's say, were Russians who might have moved to Israel, or for some reason, maybe they were Russian Jews or whatever. And now, given all the chaos there, they're moving back because they understand that we don't want to be in this place. This is too, crazy. And especially, there are even jokes now. People joke about, for instance, the famous Russian pop singer Alla Pugacheva, who went to Israel amid the onset of the Ukrainian war, the SMO, and how she was going there because she was saying, "Well, there's no war here." Well, now you see what the situation is like. I mean, it's even worse there in terms of war than it certainly is here. Here, it almost feels like there's no war, actually, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. So what else in the economic forum did you hear? I mean, was Iran a major talking point besides the economic?
No, not only Iran. I mean, Iran was a major talking point because it's a thing on everybody's mind and everybody's lips nowadays in international affairs. I mean, as you watch the news, in particular Monday night, uh, as I was mentioning to you offline before I went on live on your show, that it felt like, because I mean, even though I'm Armenian, I grew up in the United States. And I lived through the period of the Iraq War in the United States, and I remember the lead up to the war, and I remember the drumbeat in the American media and the cable news media, leading up to the war. And that's what it felt like Monday night from what I could gather, So again, I'm an Armenian American guy. I observed what this was like going on in the Iraq War in 2003. And it was a repeat of that Monday night. But what was interesting, Pascal, is somehow, in some way, and maybe this is a sign of hope, although I'm not terribly hopeful, that somehow it was delayed. It looked like Trump for sure was going to go to war with Iran Monday night. And then somehow something happened. He talked to actually his national security people, which would include Tulsi Gabbard. Now, before that, he was saying, as he was coming back from the G7, I don't care what she says. I know he was confident, even though she was saying Iran has no intention of creating a bomb. Trump was saying, I don't care what she says. I know they're making a bomb. Okay. And so there was real fear that something might, go down. But in the end, somehow that was averted. Last night too. Last night, it seemed like the same thing was going to happen. And then suddenly nothing happened. So it's difficult to, and also a lot of this is exacerbated by the personality. Because when we talk about history, right? So I'm a historian. I did a book on Anastas Mikoyan. So I look at kind of the role of individuals in history. And what's incredible is how personalities impact what happens, right? Now, of course, there are larger, contexts and there's larger, like, the systemic situations in history. But when you look at a situation like this, a lot of the tension is exacerbated by the personality of Trump himself. So Trump is the kind of person who, within 24 hours, can change his position 4 times.
Yeah.
And that doesn't help the situation. It
No,
keeps you on edge constantly,
no. It also, I mean, one of the things that I keep wondering about is how to sell this, because like the Iraq war overall was still easier to sell to the US general public and also the Europeans to some extent because of this weapon of mass destruction narrative that was new at the time, or at least new for that period. But now it's like just a repeat, rinse and repeat, right? And it's just, you can see how it doesn't stick anymore, and how even Tulsi Gabbard was able to preemptively hollow out that argument because she made that statement in front of the of Congress, right? And this is being used at the moment quite a lot. But one of the fears that still is around is some sort of false flag attack, and Ray McGovern is fearing that one of the older ships that are now on the way to the Gulf might become such an instance, where you need to just sink a ship in order then to get the attack that you need on the country in order to justify shooting back, which is.
And also that brings me to another point which needs to be mentioned in this podcast, which is the fact that Iran has the ability to shut the Straits
Oh, yeah.
Hormuz. And if they did that, imagine what would happen to the global economy. Imagine what would happen to the American economy, which is already not in the best of shape,
Yeah.
despite the fact that no matter what Joe Biden was saying about how wonderful the American economy was, it had many problems.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, yeah, I mean, Iran has enormous leverage, which should not be underestimated
Yeah.
in the context of this conflict. One thing I want to say, though, about Iraq, which is an important point, is that you talk about this idea of trying to sell the war. We go back to, Chomsky's idea of the manufacturing consent, right? And the problem here is that, there's such distrust of the cable news media in the United States that it's almost like nobody listens to them anymore. And the question is, why do they still feel a need to sell the war? Because the elites, on behalf, the elites that are kind of dictating the terms to the media is just going to carry out, what they want anyway. I mean, they're going to do what the elites are going to do what they want anyway. So why do we even need to kind of condition the population for anything? At this point, they're just going to do whatever they want. And so that's like another thought that kind of comes to my mind. But I mean, it's something maybe for a discussion, but it's just like something that crossed my mind as I was thinking about this, that why do they still feel the need to try and sell this? Because the elites on whose behalf they're acting, uh, just are going to do whatever they want anyway.
Yeah, I
Can you
mean,
think?
I had this discussion last night as well, and my take is like, look, the narrative control over the media that was established in the US and in Europe to a good extent came as an answer to the way that public dissent in the end shut down the Vietnam War. It was the
Oh
loss
yeah.
of trust, and this system is still in place, and large scale public opposition in Europe and in the United States would still have the threat, at least the threat of shutting this down, right? So you need to, at least to a certain extent, to make use of that machinery and hope that it does the job well enough.
And I also believe that in the case of Europe, the opposition to these wars was actually, especially in continental Europe,
Yeah.
was actually much stronger. Although
Yeah.
even in the UK, even despite Blair's, alliance with W, at the end of the day, the British public was very much against the Iraq War. But it's important to keep in mind, how the Americans kind of got the number of the continental Europeans, or the CIA, let's say. They got the number of the continental Europeans, and now you see how continental Europe is acting. They're like the most loyal. They're more Catholic than the Pope,
Yeah.
if we can use that phrase. And that's actually the great irony here. It used to be the Europeans were very skeptical of all these wars. And again, like I mentioned um, earlier on another podcast, it's like, Europe knows what war does, especially Germany. So what Merz is doing is criminal. Well,
Yes.
I mean, in terms of his support of Israel, his support of continuing the war in Ukraine, and it's criminal because the legacy of war in Germany. Think about how Germany was devastated by war, and the fact that Merz has no compunction about bringing Germany into threat of war with Russia, even though Germany isn't even prepared for war with Russia. Think about how utterly criminal and reckless that is. And not only that, also with Gaza, I mean, the Germans, there is a sense of guilt, lingering guilt over the Holocaust, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you should translate that into unconditional support of whatever Israel does. It means that you have a moral obligation as the German people to oppose atrocities and genocide. And so what they're doing actually, in fact, is desecrating the memory of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust by allowing the genocide in Gaza to continue.
No,
And by sponsoring it, I mean, really.
psychologically, it's actually absolutely beautiful, because you take your own guilt of what you as a nation did 80 years ago to the Jews, and then you project all of that into the Palestinians, into somebody who never was a Nazi, somebody who never did that, and then you claim that now they carry the guilt, and now we're gonna help the former victim to eradicate and undo our guilt. So it's kind of
It's really, yeah, it's really.
it's that because they talk about it in this sense. They talk about it. They constantly equate the Hamas with the Nazis. And no, you are the Nazis. They were the Nazis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not the Arabs. The Arabs were not the Nazis. But that's being made at the moment, and not only in Israel but also in Germany.
Also, I think that Europe is going to have to do a lot of soul searching after all these wars because, again, with the legacy of wars in Europe, when you look at the wars of religion, when you look at, the World War I, World War II, when you look, I mean, just the devastation that war has brought to Europe in all its forms, right? Or 100 Years' War. We can go on and on and on about the history of wars in Europe. And yet, at the end of the day, it's like Europe didn't learn anything. The whole idea, at least how the EU was sold to citizens of European countries, was that this was going to be a post-war Europe. Post-war in all senses, not just post-World War II, but post all wars. That we're not going to do this anymore, and that the relations between France and Germany are the bedrock for peace in continental Europe, and that suddenly we're not going to have this anymore. We're done with wars. We're finished, and all that. And how does it look that now Europe is jumping up and down, shouting for more war? It's a betrayal of when they talk about European values, and they love talking about European values in Brussels. But the highest European value is the opposition to the war. And yet they're jumping up and down for war. And that's what I think is so incredible, that this is a betrayal of the idea of European unity. If you're talking about genuine European unity, not this kind of neoliberal vision of the bureaucrats, but genuine European unity should be based on the idea of opposition to war. And yet they're furthering this. It's criminal what they're doing.
It is. And the only way we can make sense of that is by saying, like, look, we have the Speech Act values that they pretend to have, and then we have the actual values. And the actual values are more war and genocide. I mean, Europe has been doing those for 500 years. And also more legacy, not to the Speech Act.
Well, also, but not only more war and genocide, but also profits, unfortunately.
Oh yeah,
and think about the killing that they're making financially from this. But again, just it's so obscene. It's just so obscene that after all this history of war, you would think that the Europeans would learn something, and they haven't learned anything. And that's what I'm saying. It's going to create, when all of this, especially with Ukraine, once the Russians, because it's most likely Russia, I mean, it is highly likely Russia is going to win in Ukraine. They already are winning. It's going to create like this existential shock that the Europeans are going to wonder, how did we, get into this? Why? There's going to be kind of maybe a new existentialist movement, because there's going to be a wrestling with these questions. How did Europe once again find itself in this position where European leaders are advocating for war? Like it's 1914.
I wish I could support that, but I don't think so, because the European mindset is also one which is resistant to self-doubt. They don't doubt themselves. They do not have this moment where they go like, the Monty Python sketch, are we the baddies? The trenches, the Germans and all this. Are we the baddies? Europe doesn't do that. They don't do this. They don't ask this. So they have already now the enemy, and the new Hitler is in the new Hitlers. They sit in they sit in Moscow. They sit in Tehran, and the new. So that's the rationalization, unfortunately. But we see this now, and you and I and others, let's call it the the thinking observers of the planet, we see how the European Union itself is spiraling into something very dark, and the stupid
it's been
pronouncements.
It's been
Kaya
spiraling into something. It's been, yeah, well, Kaya Kalas, but I mean, it's been spiraling into something dark for quite some time, Pascal. I mean, you saw the Eurozone crisis. That's also another, talk about lack of introspection. That's just within the last few years.
Yeah.
I'm talking like the last 20 years. And yet there's no reflection on, the crisis, how maybe we can avert something like this, how we can help EU citizens. No, the discussion is not about helping European citizens. The discussion is how can we increase defense budgets? That's what the discussion is.
Yeah.
So we won't learn to speak Russian, as Kaya Kalas says, because if you don't increase your defense budget, you're going to be speaking Russian. As if the Russians are going to come to Paris and they're going to come to, I don't know, Geneva in the near future or something like this, something radical, something crazy like this.
These are the moments when I need to remind, especially my Swiss compatriots, that never in the history of my country were we attacked by the Russians. On the contrary, the Russians helped liberate us from the French back before during Napoleon. That's constantly forgotten. And but this is the Europeans. What do the Russians make out of such dumb speaking acts from like Kaya Kallas? Also remembering that Kaya Kallas is a Soviet-born daughter of a former of a communist apparatchik who's now running part of the EU. I mean, this is the irony of the whole thing.
Well, they separate out somebody like Kaya Kallas from, I mean, they separate out Kaya Kallas from like the mainline Eurocrats like von der Leyen, because from the perspective of the Russians, when they look at the kind of continental West Europeans, there is a sense of betrayal. That you were very reasonable and rational toward us, even as late as 2021, early 2022, and yet all of a sudden now look at how you're acting. In particular, the Germans, which I have to say, bravo to the American military-industrial complex, because they managed to take Germany and turn it into the most fanatically anti-Russian country within a course of 3 years. That takes, that's a pretty, successful feat. As for Kaya Kallas, like I said, they look at it slightly differently because, again, Estonia was part of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, there's this legacy of, they also look at this is a Baltic, nationalist and somebody who really is just, radicalized by her points of view. And that this is also being fed, actually, irresponsibly by the West, and particularly by the United States, and that the Baltic nations, the Baltic nationalities, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, would naturally try to find an accommodation with us, the Russians, if the Americans weren't encouraging this. By the way, Pascal, there are actually quite a few Baltic citizens, and I don't mean Russians in the Baltic states. I mean ethnic Estonians, ethnic Latvians, ethnic Lithuanians, who don't want a war with the Russians, and who actually feel as if their elites are pushing them toward a war. Now, they don't have, the megaphone, and they don't have the, political power to, even though probably that's a silent majority, they don't have the political power really to change things. But at the end of the day, most of the people of the Baltic states, maybe they want to be independent from Russia. They don't want to be part of the CIS. Maybe they want to be part of the European Union and all this, integrate into Western structures. But there's no appetite in those countries for confrontation with Russia. But yet the elites in those countries really are trying to push. There's a sense that they really are trying to push Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia toward a confrontation with Russia. And many citizens of these countries are legitimately afraid because they understand that if a war does break out, we're right on the front line. And is the US going to come and save the day? I mean, there's a lot of wiggle room even in Article 5 of NATO. And so you have to think about all this. I mean, how really even Baltic citizens, even some of whom I know personally, don't want a war with Russia. But the elites are the ones driving it. And the elites are being fed and encouraged by the United States rather than discouraged. And that actually serves a purpose. So then what happens if the Baltic elites keep on feeding this notion of constant war with Russia? That will kind of justify the need to buy more weapons from the United States, from NATO, and to kind of keep business running. right?
Yeah,
Without any regard to the security of your own citizens or the security of the Baltic region. And
obviously.
that's kind of how it is. Yeah.
No, it's a racket. It's absolutely a racket, and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's also a very very self-destructive way forward. The question then is how does Russia interact with that? Because as you said, and I also completely agree, Russia doesn't want a war with the Baltics, doesn't want a war with Finland, doesn't want a war with NATO, doesn't want a war with a larger with Europe. I
Well,
mean, the major reason to intervene in Ukraine the way Russia did is in order to not actually have then a larger war with NATO. So
yeah,
what's the
absolutely.
strategy to deal with this level of uh, incompetence on the European continent?
Well, it's difficult to say because the Russians, frankly, I'll give you this: despite being constantly villainized in the West, the Russians are often playing the role of the adult in the room in these scenarios. Like they will only respond to an escalation if they really need to. They do not want to see they do not want to see the situation in the Baltic region escalate further than it has been escalating. And we also have to consider something else that when I mentioned about how the Russians felt betrayed by, the continental West Europeans, the sense of betrayal is much stronger when it comes to Finland and Sweden, the Scandinavian countries in particular, because especially Finland, because in St. Petersburg, in particular, a special relationship had developed between Russia and Finland. And the fact that Finland became so, vocally anti-Russian um, amid, everything going on with the war in Ukraine, um, that just really, bothered the Russians. As if, the Winter War was coming back or something like that. And obviously Russia has no designs on Finland. There's no justification for any fear from Russia, or there's not going to be any imminent Russian attack on Finland. And yet, actually, even if you go to Viborg here, which is right on the border between Russia and Finland, right outside St. Petersburg, you can even see, like at the Viborg Museum, um, even as late as the last few years, there were Russian-Finnish collaborations on the history of Viborg because Viborg had been a Finnish city in the recent history, as we know. So there was a lot of actually exchange and interaction, and the fact that this was all canceled overnight, the Finns suddenly took a completely diametrically opposite point of view toward the Russians and a very hostile point of view overnight. That feeds this kind of sense that we feel betrayed by them, and also frankly the Finns are making an incredible mistake because by being neutral you were independent. In fact, actually Finland in its own way was a player. So this actually goes to what you say when you talk about neutrality studies, when you talk about Switzerland. Finland and Sweden were stronger and more independent as neutral countries, and they were models. You could even make the case. So I know maybe this is an overstatement. Maybe it was as somebody a Swiss might think that this is an overstatement, but that it makes these countries more relevant to humanity. Because if you take the neutral position, then you're more or less speaking for the majority of the globe. So while yes, there is a increased confrontation between Moscow and Washington, at least the middle doesn't want this and can be a platform for peace. So Helsinki can be a platform for peace, Geneva can be a platform for peace, Stockholm can be a platform for peace. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, nowadays the elites don't see that, and that's what I think is the greatest tragedy. Also, something else I want to just add. What's really incredible to me is when you look at a map of the Cold War Europe, and you look at the Warsaw Pact states, and you look at the NATO countries. What's amazing is how tame the map looks, in the sense that, with a few exceptions, like the border between East and West Germany, or between Turkey and the Caucasus, that the border between the Warsaw Pact countries and the West was lined with neutral
Yes.
countries,
Yes.
like let's say in the south, Austria and Yugoslavia, in the north, Finland and Sweden. And now what do you have? You have countries right that are openly hostile to Russia, right on Russia's borders,
Yeah.
right next to St. Petersburg. And how does that, there's no, again, no sense of introspection. How does this enhance, uh, Europe's security? Does it make Russia feel more comfortable? Obviously
No.
not.
And these people argue like that. And that's my entire point. These buffer states have a very important role to play, and it's not just being a physical buffer. You know, neutral states are usually eliminated by the stronger part in a conflict, because neutral states are often can be used and are often used as off ramps by the weaker or the more peaceful ones. So the war hawks have an incentive to also take out the neutrals, because
Yes.
wouldn't have the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe if it wasn't for Finland, because the Soviets wanted to have that. It was a Soviet idea, but they didn't know
Yeah.
how to pitch it to the West. So they told Finland, please pitch it. Finland pitched it. And because it came from neutral Finland, the others had to react. And that set in
Yeah.
motion a 5-year long process where at the end, then again, through the cooperation of the neutrals, you had the largest kind of trans-European, trans-Eurasian, and Atlantic peace framework that we have seen in the last century. But all of that is out. There's no more appetite in Europe for any kind of such cooperative peace at the moment. And I would hope that Russia at least keeps working on the designs, even if the Europeans don't want to participate.
Well, maybe one day the Europeans will come back to the adults table, and maybe one day it will change. And that's the only thing. We have to have hope, some hope for that. I know that you're not terribly hopeful about that, but in many respects, I think eventually it's going to have to change. I mean, because Europe, I mean, history goes through cycles.
Yeah.
The Russian historian Karamzin says history goes in spirals, right? So it is quite possible that the Europeans will become sober at some point and will want to come back, like I said, to the adult table, especially on these questions of war and peace.
I would
But
hope
yeah,
so. I would hope so. Just the problem is at the moment they've regressed so far. They are now in their own poopy diapers. So it will take at
oh,
least 25 to 30 years to nourish them back into something halfway respectable. Anyhow, Pietro, we're nearing the 1 hour mark.
oh.
People who want to read from you, where should they go?
Well, I mean, I publish on the American Committee for East-West Accord. That's usually where my writings are. Although in the past I've written for The Nation magazine and other publications as well. I have a book coming out on Anastas Mikoyan, an Armenian reformer in Khrushchev's Kremlin, right? And it's about mostly about his domestic reforms like de-Stalinization, reforms of nationality policy, efforts, by the way, and this is something that's not well known. Even in the former Soviet countries, efforts by Mikoyan and Khrushchev to actually democratize the Soviet Union. There were actually efforts to try and evolve, the Soviet socialist system toward what they called socialist democracy, to give the citizens a direct say in the governing process. Now, why would Khrushchev want that? Because he had problems with the bureaucrats, and he thought, well, you know what? If we have, actual elections, first of all, two things are solved. Number one, President Kennedy will no longer be able to say that we don't have free elections. That's number one. And number two, we'll be able to constantly rotate these bureaucrats out of power, and then it won't be a problem. I mean, that it would kind of keep things fresh, so to speak. But as we know, Khrushchev was overthrown in 1964. The so-called thaw of Khrushchev ended, and that was it. But my book talks about this, and also about the efforts of Mikoyan to basically give more powers to the republics and autonomous entities. It could have been a completely different history in the Soviet Union.
When will the book come out?
A book will come out in August 2025.
Okay.
Now, I didn't even touch on Mikoyan's diplomatic roles. Like we talk about Cuba, we talk about his engagement with Europe, with United States, and we could go on about that. But the domestic reforms are something that have been very understudied, and also I go in depth on de-Stalinization. So this whole effort to kind of rehabilitate former political prisoners, Mikoyan played a huge role in this. Former political prisoners even advised Mikoyan and Khrushchev on the de-Stalinization process. So all this is in the book. It's basically a work that started off as my dissertation, and I've been more or less working on it since 2018. It's all based on materials in the Russian and Armenian languages that nobody knows about. I've been working deeply in the Russian archives, in all the major Russian federal archives, Ergaspi, Garf, Ergani, Ergali, all of them. I've been working, and also even, of course, the Armenian archives in Yerevan, and even I have materials from Memorial, the Memorial Society in Russia that I used for this book. So it's an enormous book, and it's all new material. Unfortunately, when they sent me the final version, I still spotted maybe one or two minor issues, here and there, but that's to be expected with any book. But overall, it's really good, and I think that I really Indiana University Press should be commended because they did an enormous, wonderful job. Wonderful editors I worked with, wonderful people, and wonderful designers too. The cover is amazing.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you're happy with your book and with the way it comes out, because it's such a long process. We will do a separate talk on this one. I think it absolutely merits an hour on Amastas Mikoyan and the unknown history of the Soviet Union that could have been. But for today, I would like to thank you very much. The links will be in the description. Pietro Shakarian, thank you for your time today.
Pascal, pleasure as always. Thank you.